The tea in her cup had gone entirely cold. A thin, iridescent film of oils pooled on the surface, reflecting the dull afternoon light filtering through the heavy drapes. He was speaking, saying sensible, measured words like incompatibility and allowance. But all Briella could focus on was the horrific, rhythmic scraping of his signet ring against the mahogany desk. She didn't weep. She didn't hurl the porcelain saucer. She simply stood, her knees popping loudly in the silent study, and walked out. The brass clock on the mantelpiece ticked with an infuriating, uneven cadence. It was a heavy, ugly thing shaped like a Greek temple, a gift from Aidan's mother that Briella had spent 3 years pretending to admire. Right now, it was the loudest sound in the room. Aidan Gibson sat behind his massive oak desk, a fortress of inherited wealth, looking everywhere but at her. He looked at the inkwell. He looked at the brass bulldog paperweight. He looked at the neat stack of legal documents resting beneath the manicured hands of his solicitor, Mr. Abernathy. Mr. Abernathy was sweating. The scent of it, stale, sour, and laced with cheap peppermint pastilles, drifted across the desk and mingled with the heavy, cloying odour of beeswax furniture polish. "The settlement, as you can see, is quite generous," Mr. Abernathy said. His voice was a reedy wheeze, slipping through the gap in his front teeth. "Mr. Gibson wishes to ensure you are not left destitute, given the suddenness of the, change in circumstances." Briella stared at the papers. The heavy vellum looked slightly yellow in the dim light of the study. A single beam of weak autumn sunlight had managed to pierce the soot-stained windows, illuminating a slow-moving column of dust motes hovering directly between her and Aidan. She felt nothing. Or rather, she felt everything, but compacted so densely into her chest that it manifested as a leaden numbness. Her corset, which had felt perfectly tailored at breakfast, was suddenly digging a sharp, unforgiving line of whalebone into her lower ribs. She took a shallow breath. The air tasted like old paper and cowardice. "Generous," Briella repeated. Her voice didn't crack. It didn't tremble with righteous fury. It sounded flat, slightly hoarse, as if she had just woken from a long, unrefreshing nap. Aidan finally glanced up. His eyes, a pale, watery blue that she had once convinced herself were kind, now merely looked anxious. Not guilty, just anxious that she might make a scene. He had a weak chin, she realized suddenly. How had she never noticed that before? For 3 years she had looked at his face, and only now, in the final 10 minutes of their association, did she notice that his jawline vanished entirely into his cravat. "Briella, you must understand," Aidan started, his voice adopting that placating, reasonable tone he used when speaking to stable boys or overly emotional dogs. "My father's debts, the estate, the pressure. Lady Caroline brings an alliance that saves Gibson Hall. I fought it. You must know I fought it. He hadn't fought it. Briella knew exactly how Aidan fought. He didn't. He surrendered to the heaviest pressure applied to him at any given moment. Right now, his mother's demands and the crushing weight of the estate's ledgers were heavier than Briella's entirely inadequate dowry. It was mathematics. She couldn't even be enraged by it. It was too predictable. "Lady Caroline," Briella murmured. She didn't spit the name. She just let it sit in the air, heavy and solid. Caroline was 19. She smelled of lavender water and giggled into her gloved hands. Briella was 26. She smelled of the lye soap she used to launder her own undergarments when her aunt couldn't afford the washerwoman, and her youth had been spent nursing a dying father, not learning the pianoforte. Briella looked down at her left hand. The sapphire ring sat on her third finger. It was ostentatious, a heavy, square-cut stone surrounded by too many diamonds. It caught on her gloves. It tore the delicate threads of her shawls. She had hated it since the day he slid it onto her hand. Slowly, deliberately, she reached over with her right hand and pinched the cold metal. "Briella, please," Aidan whispered. "Keep it, a token, a safety net." She didn't answer. The ring stuck at her knuckle. It always did. Her hands were practical, slightly wider at the joints than a proper lady's ought to be. She pulled, feeling the sharp scrape of the gold setting against her skin. A brief flare of pain, sharp and immediate, cut through the fog in her brain. She yanked harder. The ring popped loose, leaving behind a pale, indented ring of skin on her finger. It looked naked, vulnerable. She placed the ring exactly in the center of the brass bulldog's head. It balanced there for a second before sliding off and hitting the mahogany with a sharp, final clack. "Keep your money, Aidan," Briella said. She didn't sound heroic. She sounded tired. The thought of accepting an allowance, a pension for a discarded fiancé, made acid rise in the back of her throat. It wasn't pride, it was disgust. She didn't want his name on a bank draft arriving on the 1st of every month, a constant monthly reminder of her own inadequacy. "Miss Anderson, I strongly advise against rash decisions," Mr. Abernathy squeaked, pushing the vellum forward. "Pride does not pay the butcher." "Neither does a coward's guilt," she replied. She turned away. She didn't look back to see Aidan's reaction. She didn't care. Her heavy wool skirt rustled against the Persian rug as she walked to the door. Her hand closed over the cool brass of the doorknob. It was slightly tarnished on the underside. She turned it, stepped into the hallway, and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind her. It didn't slam. It clicked into place with a quiet, devastating finality. The hallway was vast, drafty, and smelled of lemon oil. The footman, a boy of no more than 15, was standing rigidly by the front doors. His eyes darted toward her, wide and entirely too perceptive, before snapping back to stare blankly at the opposite wall. The servants knew. Of course they did. Briella walked toward the exit. Her gait was stiff. She felt as though her joints had rusted over in the space of 20 minutes. "Your cloak, miss," the footman mumbled, stepping forward to offer the heavy, dark green garment. She took it without a word, swinging it over her shoulders. The wool was rough against her neck. She didn't wait for him to open the heavy double doors. She reached out, grabbed the iron handle, and threw her weight into it, stepping out onto the stone portico and descending into the grey afternoon. The sky above the city was a bruised, mottled purple, threatening a downpour that hadn't quite possessed the conviction to start. Instead, a miserable, persistent drizzle misted the air, clinging to everything it touched. It wasn't a dramatic, cleansing rain. It was an irritant. Briella walked. She didn't wait for a hackney cab. She didn't have the shillings to spare anyway. She gripped the edges of her cloak tightly across her chest, her knuckles turning white in the damp chill, and focused entirely on the ground in front of her. The pavement was slick with a layer of city grime, a vile mixture of mud, horse dung, and pulverized coal dust. With every step, the grit ground audibly beneath the thin, impractical leather soles of her walking boots. They were town boots, meant for stepping from a carriage to a pristine walkway, not for marching across the squalid reality of the city's lower districts. Already she could feel the damp seeping through the stitching near her right toes. A carriage rattled past her, its heavy wooden wheels hitting a pothole and sending a spray of dirty brown water onto the hem of her skirt. Briella stopped. She looked down at the dark, wet stains blooming across the green wool. She stood frozen on the edge of the curb, people rushing past her, bumping her shoulders, entirely indifferent to her existence. A woman with a basket of wilting cabbages shoved past, muttering a curse. A pair of clerks in cheap woolen suits laughed loudly at some private joke, their breath pluming in the cold air. The world had not stopped. The sky had not fallen. Her entire life, her secured future, the promise of a home, the respectability of being Mrs. Aidan Gibson, had just evaporated into the damp air, and the street sweepers were still asking for halfpence. The absurdity of it finally pierced the numbness. A dry, humourless huff of breath escaped her lips. It wasn't a laugh. It was a physical rejection of the situation. She resumed walking, her pace quicker now, driven by a sudden, jagged surge of panic. What now? The question wasn't philosophical. It was purely logistical. She lived with her Aunt Matilda in a cramped, draughty townhouse that smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage and old cats. Matilda had tolerated Briella's presence only because the Gibson engagement promised a substantial return on investment. Once Aidan married, he was supposed to provide Matilda with a comfortable cottage in the country. Briella's mind raced, performing rapid, terrifying arithmetic. She had exactly £14, 6 shillings, and 2p saved in a tin box under her mattress. The rent was due in 3 days. The butcher had cut off their credit last week. She had no marketable skills. She could read French, but poorly. She played the piano with the mechanical stiffness of a metronome. She was too old to be a governess to a decent family, and too proud to be a lady's maid. Spinster. The word tasted like ash. A sharp gust of wind whipped down the narrow street, catching the brim of her hat. She reached up to secure it, but the sudden movement drove a rusted hatpin deep into her scalp. "Damn it!" she hissed out loud, stopping beneath the awning of a closed haberdashery. She pulled the pin out, her fingers coming away with a tiny bead of bright red blood. She stared at it, the copper smell of it mixing with the wet wool of her cloak. Her breath began to come in short, shallow gasps. The corset, which had been merely uncomfortable in Aidan's study, now felt like an iron cage compressing her lungs. The panic was no longer abstract. It was intensely physical. Her vision narrowed at the edges, the grey street blurring into indistinct smears of motion. She leaned her back against the cold brick wall of the shop, ignoring the soot that would undoubtedly stain her cloak. She squeezed her eyes shut. "Count," she told herself. 1, 2, 3, 4. She focused on the smells, the damp brick, the sharp tang of raw meat from the butcher's stall 3 doors down, the metallic smell of the wet iron street lamps. She focused on the sounds, the clatter of hooves, the shouting of a newsboy, the distant, mournful whistle of a riverboat on the Thames. She was Briella Anderson. She was 26. She was entirely alone, but she was breathing. She opened her eyes. The street came back into sharp focus. She wiped the tiny bead of blood from her finger onto the dark fabric of her skirt, straightened her shoulders, and pushed herself away from the wall. She had another mile to walk. Crying would only give her a headache, and she couldn't afford the apothecary's powders. She stepped back out into the drizzle, her boots squelching slightly. She didn't look up at the sky. She kept her eyes on the uneven cobblestones, meticulously planning her next step, and the next, refusing to look any further ahead than the space of a single yard. She heard it before she saw it. The city was a cacophony of noise, but this sound cut through the mundane clatter of delivery carts and hired hacks. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of 4 massive, perfectly synchronized horses, striking the cobblestones with the brute force of extreme wealth. Beneath the hoofbeats was the low, aggressive rumble of carriage wheels, not the rattling, loose-spoked wooden wheels of a street cab, but iron-banded, oiled precision. Briella didn't turn around. Such conveyances belonged to a world she had briefly touched and was now violently expelled from. She simply hugged her cloak tighter and kept to the very edge of the pavement, giving the monstrosity room to pass. but it didn't pass. The thunder of hooves slowed, transitioning into a heavy, stomping walk directly beside her. The carriage, an immense, glossy, black-lacquered beast of a thing, paced her. The mud from its massive wheels sloughed off in thick clumps, dangerously close to her already ruined hem. Briella stopped. She frowned, irritation momentarily overriding her despair. She turned, fully prepared to glare at whatever arrogant peer had decided to monopolize the gutter. The carriage groaned to a halt. A crest was painted on the heavy door in subtle, dark gold. A snarling wolf holding a broken sword. The crest of Ashbourne. Her breath caught, snagging painfully in her dry throat. The door didn't wait for a footman. It was shoved open from the inside with a violent crack. The hinges squealed in protest. A man stepped out, ignoring the fold-out steps entirely, and dropped his heavy boots directly into the filthy puddle pooling by the curb. Mud splattered against his dark leather riding boots, but he didn't even glance down. Nathaniel Croft, the Duke of Ashbourne. He was not a man one saw by accident. He was a notorious recluse, a man who possessed half of the county and chose to spend his time breeding ill-tempered horses and ignoring Parliament. He had been at Aidan's engagement dinner 6 months ago, Aidan's distant, vastly superior cousin, and had spent the entire evening looking as though he wanted to set fire to the table centerpieces. He stood before her now, an imposing, solid wall of dark wool and tailored aggression. He wasn't conventionally handsome. His features were too sharp, his nose possessed a slight crook from an old break, and his eyes, a startling, piercing grey, were set deep beneath dark, straight brows. He smelled of rain-soaked heavy wool, leather, and a faint, sharp scent of clove. "You are making a spectacle, Miss Anderson," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated over the ambient noise of the street. It wasn't a greeting. It wasn't a question. It was a blunt, almost clinical observation. Briella stared at him. Her brain, already overloaded, simply refused to process his presence. "I am walking," she managed to say, her voice cracking slightly. "You are marching through the slums of the city, looking like a woman who is deciding which bridge to throw herself off," Nathaniel countered. He didn't move closer, but his presence seemed to consume the oxygen in her immediate vicinity. "I am going home," Briella snapped, the numbness finally shattering, replaced by a sudden hot spike of defensive rage. "And I would appreciate it if you did not block the pavement. Your carriage is enormous and unnecessary." Nathaniel looked at her, really looked at her. His gaze dropped to her ruined boots, the mud clinging to her skirt, the damp strands of dark hair plastered to her cheek, and finally rested on her bare left hand. He stared at the pale indentation on her ring finger for a fraction of a second longer than was polite. Something flickered in his jaw, a tightening of muscle, quickly suppressed. "Aidan is an idiot," Nathaniel stated flatly. The sheer bluntness of the statement hit Briella like a physical blow. She blinked, her mouth opening slightly, unable to form a coherent response. Society dictated that one offered condolences, or politely pretended nothing had happened. One did not announce the idiocy of the ex-fiancé in the middle of a muddy street. "Get in," Nathaniel said, gesturing sharply toward the dark, cavernous interior of the carriage. "I will not," Briella said instantly, her spine stiffening. "Miss Anderson." He sighed, a harsh, exhaled breath that plumed in the cold air. He looked thoroughly annoyed, yet he didn't break eye contact. "You are wet. You are freezing. You are bleeding from the side of your head." Briella's hand flew to her scalp, her fingers brushing the spot where the hat pin had pricked her. It wasn't bleeding much, just a smear of red, but the realization made her cheeks flush with deep, humiliating heat. "I do not require your charity, Your Grace," she said, lifting her chin. The rain was beginning to fall harder now, heavy, fat drops striking the brim of her hat and his broad shoulders. "It is not charity, it is practical," Nathaniel said. He took one step closer. The sheer size of him blocked out the street traffic. "You have exactly two options. You can continue to walk 3 miles in a downpour, arrive at your aunt's house looking like a drowned rat, and give every gossip in this city the satisfaction of seeing your misery. Or you can get in my carriage, drink a glass of brandy, and allow me to convey you to your door in a manner that suggests you are entirely unbothered." He paused, his grey eyes narrowing slightly, studying the defiant set of her shoulders. "Do not let him have the satisfaction of your ruin, Briella." He used her Christian name. It wasn't an intimacy. It felt like a tactical strike. It stripped away the polite veneer of their non-existent acquaintance. Briella looked at his outstretched hand. He wasn't offering it like a courtier asking for a dance. His hand was large, ungloved, and calloused across the knuckles. He was offering it like a man extending a rope over a cliff edge. She looked back down at her boots. Her toes were completely numb. The water seeping into her soles felt like ice. She thought of her Aunt Matilda waiting to scream at her. She thought of Aidan, sitting in his dry, warm study, probably pouring a celebratory glass of sherry. A violent, ugly shudder racked her body. It wasn't just the cold, it was the exhaustion. She looked back up at the Duke. He hadn't moved. He wasn't impatient. He was simply waiting, an immovable object in the middle of her chaotic collapse. Slowly, her fingers trembling slightly, Briella reached out. She didn't place her hand daintily in his. She grabbed his forearm. The muscle beneath his heavy wool sleeve was like corded steel. Nathaniel didn't flinch. His large hand closed securely over her elbow, his grip warm and surprisingly gentle given his rough demeanor. With a single, smooth pull, he hoisted her up the carriage step. The interior of the coach was overwhelmingly rich. It smelled intensely of polished cedar, expensive leather, and that faint hint of clove. The velvet squabs were dark crimson. Briella collapsed onto the backward-facing bench, her stiff skirts crumpling awkwardly around her. She was acutely aware of the mud she was tracking onto the pristine floorboards. Nathaniel climbed in after her, moving with a fluid grace that belied his size. He grabbed the handle and slammed the door shut. The heavy thud sealed them in, instantly cutting off the noise of the rain and the shouting street. The silence inside the carriage was sudden and absolute, broken only by the rhythmic breathing of the man sitting opposite her. He reached up and knocked twice on the roof of the carriage. Instantly, the conveyance lurched forward, the immense power of the 4 horses smoothing out the rough cobblestones. Nathaniel sat back against the squabs. He didn't look at her immediately. Instead, he opened a small mahogany compartment built into the carriage wall, withdrew a crystal decanter of amber liquid, and poured a generous measure into a thick glass tumbler. He held it out to her. Briella stared at the glass. "I don't drink brandy." "You do today," he replied, his voice leaving no room for argument. She took the glass. Her hands were shaking so badly that the liquid sloshed against the rim. She brought it to her lips and took a swallow. It burned. It was a vile, fiery path down her throat that brought tears to her eyes. But almost immediately, a heavy, radiating warmth began to bloom in her chest, pushing back the edges of the cold. She lowered the glass, coughing slightly. Nathaniel watched her. He had poured nothing for himself. He rested his elbows on his knees, leaning forward slightly so that he took up entirely too much space in the enclosed cabin. "Now," the Duke of Ashbourne said softly, the harsh edge of his voice softening into something dangerously intense. Tell me exactly what that fool said to you. The brandy sat heavy and hot in Briella's stomach, a stark contrast to the damp cold seeping upward from her ruined boots. She stared at the thick crystal of the tumbler, watching the amber liquid map the slight, involuntary tremors still shaking her hands. He offered me an allowance, Briella said. The words tasted metallic. She didn't look up at Nathaniel. She kept her eyes fixed on the muddy hem of her skirt, acutely aware of the ruin she was bringing into this pristine space. A pension, paid monthly through Mr. Abernathy, provided I retired quietly to the country and caused no embarrassment to his new bride. The silence in the carriage thickened. It wasn't an empty silence. It possessed a physical weight pressing against her eardrums. An allowance, Nathaniel repeated. His voice was utterly devoid of inflection. To prevent me from becoming destitute. Briella finally dragged her gaze up from the glass. Nathaniel was staring at her. His expression hadn't changed. It remained a mask of harsh angles and deep shadows, but the atmosphere around him had sharpened into something distinctly lethal. He was perfectly still. Even the slight sway of the carriage didn't seem to affect his posture. He looked like a man calculating the exact amount of force required to snap a spine. Aidan's debts are extensive, Nathaniel said, his tone conversational, yet carrying an undercurrent of violence. He wagered heavily on the maritime routes last spring and lost. His mother possesses a gambling habit she disguises as philanthropy. I knew he was sinking. I did not realize he intended to throw his anchor overboard to save himself. Lady Caroline's dowry will plug the holes in his ship, Briella said dryly. Lady Caroline is a child who cries when her tea is steeped too long. She will survive Aidan's spinelessness only because her father's solicitors have ironclad the marriage settlements. Nathaniel leaned back against the dark red velvet. The leather of his boots creaked. Aidan is a coward. He could have broken this off 6 months ago. Instead, he waited until his wedding suit was tailored and his creditors were sitting in his parlour. He said he fought it. The words slipped out before she could stop them. A pathetic, lingering reflex to defend the man she had spent 3 years orienting her life around. Nathaniel made a sound in the back of his throat, a low, harsh scrape of pure contempt. Aidan fights nothing. He yields to the heaviest pressure, always. And right now, the threat of debtor's prison is heavier than his mild affection for you. Mild affection. The phrase was a surgeon's scalpel, cutting straight through the bruised tissue of her pride. It was true. She had always known it was true. Their engagement hadn't been forged in passion. It had been a sensible arrangement. She was respectable, even-tempered, and managed an estate's ledgers with meticulous care. He was titled, wealthy, and needed a competent wife to offset his own lazy incompetence. It was a transaction. But to hear it reduced to mild affection stripped away the last veneer of dignity she was clinging to. She took another sharp swallow of the brandy. It didn't burn this time. It just sat like a hot stone in her chest. You are blunt, Your Grace. I'm accurate. There is a difference. Nathaniel shifted, reaching out to take the empty tumbler from her rigid fingers. His knuckles brushed hers. His skin was incredibly warm. Do not weep for him, Briella. He is not worth the salt. I am not weeping, she snapped, her spine snapping straight. I am calculating. One corner of Nathaniel's mouth twitched upward. It wasn't a smile. It was merely an acknowledgement. Good, because your immediate future requires arithmetic, not poetry. Where are we going? Number 14, Rookery Lane. Nathaniel raised a single, dark eyebrow. Rookery Lane was barely a step above a slum. It was a street characterized by peeling paint, the perpetual stench of open gutters, and desperate respectability clinging by its fingernails. It was not a place a duke's carriage ever ventured. He didn't comment. He simply knocked twice on the roof again, shouting the direction to the driver through the small ventilation slat. The carriage turned sharply. The smooth, wealthy cobblestones of the inner city gave way to the deeply rutted, uneven paving of the lower districts. The heavy suspension of the coach groaned in protest as it navigated the potholes. Briella looked out the rain-streaked window. The sky was darkening rapidly, the weak afternoon light surrendering to the gloom of the storm. Gas lamps were beginning to flicker on, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet brickwork of the passing buildings. She felt a sudden, suffocating wave of claustrophobia. Not from the carriage, but from the life waiting for her at the end of this ride. Aunt Matilda, the screaming, the recriminations, the endless, grinding anxiety of counting pennies for coal. "She will be furious," Briella whispered, speaking more to the glass window than to the Duke. "Your aunt?" She considered Aidan her retirement plan. Briella let her head fall back against the velvet squabs. The exhaustion was sinking into her bones now, a heavy, paralyzing lethargy. "She will likely throw me out, or lock me in the attic until I agree to marry Mr. Higgins, the apothecary. He is 62 and smells of sulphur, but he has expressed an interest." "You will not marry a sulphurous apothecary." The command was so absolute, so entirely confident, that Briella actually let out a short, jagged laugh. "I appreciate the decree, Your Grace, but you do not control the rent." "No," Nathaniel agreed softly, his grey eyes locking onto her profile in the dim light of the carriage. "But I control a great many other things." The carriage came to a jarring, undignified halt. The horses blew loudly, their hooves splashing in the deep, stagnant puddles that choked Rookery Lane. Briella didn't move. She stared at the peeling green paint of number 14's front door. The brass knocker, shaped like a lion's head, was tarnished black. The narrow front step was littered with wet, decaying leaves. It looked exactly as it always did, yet today it looked like the entrance to a tomb. She took a deep, shaky breath, reaching for the door handle. "Thank you for the conveyance, Your Grace." It was practical. Before her fingers could brush the brass, Nathaniel's arm shot across her, his large hand clamping over the handle. "I will escort you to the door." "That is entirely unnecessary and entirely inappropriate." Briella pushed against his arm, but it was like pushing against a seasoned oak. "If the neighbours see a duke's carriage, the gossip will outpace the post. Let them gossip." Nathaniel pushed the door open. The cold, wet air rushed in, carrying the distinct, sour odour of boiling cabbage and wet ash. "You are a woman returning home after an ordeal. I am ensuring you arrive safely. Only an idiot would find fault in that, and I do not cater to idiots." He stepped out into the rain, ignoring the fold-out steps once again, and turned, extending his hand. Briella glared at it. Then she glared at him. He stood in the downpour, his dark hair instantly flattening against his skull, his jaw set in an immovable line. He wasn't going to leave. Gritting her teeth, she placed her hand in his. He handed her down with infuriating ease. Her boots hit the pavement with a wet, squelching thud. They walked up the 3 narrow steps together. Nathaniel didn't use the tarnished knocker. He raised his fist and struck the wood with 3 heavy, resounding blows that made the entire doorframe rattle. Muffled footsteps echoed from inside. A bolt slid back with a rusty shriek. The door opened to reveal Aunt Matilda. She was a bird-like woman, all sharp angles and nervous energy, smelling overwhelmingly of camphor and cheap lavender water. She wore a stained lace cap askew over thinning grey hair. Her mouth opened to unleash a reprimand about mud on the steps. but the words died instantly in her throat. Her pale, bulging eyes darted from Briella's ruined dress to the towering, drenched figure of the Duke of Ashbourne, and finally to the massive black carriage idling in the street. "Briella," Matilda gasped, her voice shrill and trembling. "What is the meaning of this? Your Grace, what has happened? Was there an accident?" Matilda's eyes searched frantically for blood, her mind already calculating the social leverage of an carriage accident involving a duke. "An accident of character, madam," Nathaniel said smoothly. He stepped forward, forcing Matilda to retreat a step into the cramped, poorly lit hallway. He didn't remove his hat. He didn't bow. "Aidan Gibson has broken the engagement." The silence in the hallway was absolute. Briella watched her aunt's face. She watched the polite, fawning confusion curdle instantly into comprehension, and then into a vicious, panicked rage. Matilda's thin lips pulled back from her teeth. "Broken?" Matilda whispered. She looked at Briella. The veneer of familial tolerance vanished, revealing the ugly, desperate resentment beneath. "What did you do?" "She did nothing," Nathaniel interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, resonating off the peeling wallpaper. "Gibson is financially ruined and has sold himself to the highest bidder to avoid debtor's prison. He lacks the spine to honour his commitments." Matilda didn't care about Aidan's spine. She cared about her cottage in the country. "You fool!" she hissed at Briella, her voice vibrating with venom. "You stupid, arrogant fool! I told you not to be so cold with him. I told you to secure the license. 3 years I have fed you. 3 years I have clothed you for that man's parlour, and you let him slip away." "Aunt Matilda, please," Briella started, stepping forward. "Do not speak to me," Matilda shrieked, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "You are ruined. We are both ruined. You will be out of this house by tomorrow. I will not harbour a discarded spinster. I will not starve because you couldn't keep a man's attention." Briella flinched. The words were exactly what she had expected, but hearing them spoken aloud, echoing in the cramped hallway, made her stomach violently contract. The smell of cabbage was suddenly overwhelming. She felt the bile rising in her throat. She opened her mouth to apologize, to beg for a few days to find lodgings, entirely prepared to humiliate herself for the sake of a roof over her head. "She will be out of this house in 10 minutes. Nathaniel's voice cut through Matilda's hysteria like a broadsword. Both women snapped their heads toward him. The Duke stepped fully into the hallway, his large frame making the narrow space feel suffocatingly small. He looked down at Matilda with an expression of such absolute, freezing disgust that the older woman physically recoiled, pressing her back against the faded wallpaper. "Get your things, Miss Anderson," Nathaniel said, not looking at Briella. His eyes remained locked on Matilda. Briella froze. My things?" "Pack whatever you require for the immediate future. Leave the rest. It is undoubtedly infected with camphor and spite." Nathaniel finally turned his head to look at her. "Go." "Your Grace, I cannot." "You are currently unemployed, unhoused, and standing in wet boots in a hallway that smells of decay," Nathaniel said, stating the facts with brutal precision. "I require an archivist. The Ashbourne Library contains 6 generations of rotting manuscripts, misfiled estate ledgers, and chaotic correspondence. It requires a meticulous, unsentimental mind to order it. You have managed Gibson's disastrous ledgers for 3 years. You will now manage mine." Briella stared at him. The air left her lungs. "An archivist? For a duke? That is entirely improper. Society is currently celebrating the wedding of a coward to a teenager to pay off gambling debts," Nathaniel interrupted harshly. "I do not give a damn about society. I offer you employment. A salary that will render you entirely independent of this." He gestured vaguely toward Matilda with a look of revulsion. "And a suite of rooms in the east wing of Ashbourne House. You will answer only to me." He stepped closer to her, his voice dropping so low that Matilda couldn't hear. "Or you can stay here, Briella. You can apologize to this harpy, beg for your bed, and wait for the apothecary to come calling." It wasn't a choice. It was an ambush. Briella looked at his eyes. They were completely serious. There was no pity in them, no charity. It was a transaction. A bizarre, scandalous, entirely logical transaction. She looked back at her aunt, who was staring at the Duke with a mixture of terror and greedy calculation, already wondering how she could profit from this new scandal. Briella's jaw tightened. The numbness was gone. The panic was gone. In their place, a cold, sharp spike of absolute clarity pierced her mind. 10 minutes, Briella said. She turned on her heel, her ruined boots leaving muddy footprints on the threadbare hall runner, and walked up the stairs. The staircase up to the third floor groaned in a familiar, agonizing pitch beneath her wet boots. As Briella ascended, the heavy odor of boiled cabbage slowly yielded to the distinct, dry rot scent of the attic. Her room was tucked beneath the sloping eaves, a cramped triangle of space barely large enough to accommodate a narrow iron bedstead and a warped deal washstand. 10 minutes. She fell to her knees beside the bed, ignoring the sharp twinge in her joints, and dragged out her luggage. It was a single, battered canvas valise with stiff leather straps. The brass buckles were speckled with green verdigris. She wrenched them open, scraping her thumbnail painfully against the metal. She stood and turned to the wardrobe. It was a precarious, leaning box of cheap pine. Inside hung the sum total of her existence. She reached past the pale blue muslin daydress Matilda had forced her to buy for Aidan's mother's garden party. It smelled faintly of mothballs and false cheer. She left it on the hanger. Instead, she grabbed her heavy brown merino wool, the stiff grey skirt she wore while balancing the household accounts, and 5 plain, unadorned cotton chemises. She shoved them into the canvas bag. There was no careful folding. The garments settled into the bottom with a dull, heavy finality. From the washstand, she snatched her bone-handled hairbrush, a tin of tooth powder, and a single cake of harsh lye soap. She threw them on top of the wool. She paused, her chest heaving, the damp corset restricting her breath to shallow, painful gasps. She looked around the room. The water stain on the ceiling shaped like a distorted map of Europe. The single, draughty window overlooking the blackened chimney pots of Rookery Lane. She had spent 3 years in this room, carefully preserving her reputation, carefully ignoring Aidan's dullness, carefully building a future that had evaporated in 20 minutes. She reached under the lumpy mattress and pulled out the flat tin box. Inside was her fortune. £14, 6 shillings, and 2p. The coins clinked sharply as she shoved the tin deep into the centre of the valise, burying it beneath her undergarments. She buckled the straps. The leather was stiff and resisted her cold fingers, but she forced the prongs through the punched holes with entirely unnecessary violence. She was doing it. She was actually doing it. She was leaving the only respectable, if miserable, shelter she had to step into the carriage of an unmarried, notoriously ruthless duke to become a glorified servant. The scandal would be absolute. By tomorrow morning, her name would be entirely unmentionable in polite drawing rooms. Briella picked up the valise. It was heavy. It felt wonderfully, terribly real. She walked down the stairs. The canvas scraped against the narrow walls, knocking a flake of yellowed plaster onto the threadbare runner. Matilda was still standing in the hallway, pressed against the faded wallpaper. She looked smaller now, her earlier venom replaced by a greedy, terrified calculation. She was staring at the heavy front door, which Nathaniel had left ajar. The Duke was waiting outside on the top step, his broad back to the house, indifferent to the rain pounding against his dark wool coat. "You will ruin us," Matilda hissed, as Briella reached the bottom step. The older woman's voice was a thin, reedy whisper. "When he tires of you, do not come crawling back here. The locks will be changed." Briella stopped. She looked at her aunt. She noted the sour smell of camphor, the yellowing lace cap, the bitter, pinched lines around her mouth. A profound, overwhelming exhaustion washed over her. "I won't," Briella said softly. She didn't wait for a response. She stepped past her aunt, the valise bumping against her hip, and walked out into the downpour. Nathaniel turned at the sound of her boots on the stone. He glanced at the single, pathetic canvas bag. He didn't offer a polite, condescending observation about her lack of possessions. He simply reached out, took the heavy bag from her hand with effortless ease, and tossed it up to the waiting footman on the carriage boot. "Get in," he said. Briella climbed into the carriage. The leather squabs were still warm from where they had sat previously. She huddled into the corner, pressing her shoulder against the polished cedar paneling. Nathaniel climbed in a second later, pulling the heavy door shut, sealing out the noise of the slums and the sight of number 14 Rookery Lane forever. The carriage lurched violently as the driver whipped the horses into motion. Briella leaned her head against the glass. The cold pain bit into her cheek. She watched the peeling doors and overflowing gutters of her former life blur into a grey, watery streak. She had no reputation. She had no fiancé. She had no family. She closed her eyes. The low, rhythmic rumble of the carriage wheels vibrated up through the floorboards, matching the slow, heavy thud of her own heart. The journey from the rotting edges of the city to the pristine heart of Mayfair took nearly 40 minutes. The silence in the carriage remained unbroken, dense and complicated. Nathaniel did not attempt to soothe her. He sat completely still, his long legs stretched out, his grey eyes fixed unblinkingly on the velvet seat beside her. He looked less like a saviour and more like a predator who had successfully secured his catch and was now simply enduring the transport. Briella shivered. The dampness from her hem had wicked up to her knees. Her boots felt like blocks of solid ice. Nathaniel shifted. He reached behind him and pulled a heavy, dark wool blanket from a discreet compartment. Without a word, he leaned forward and dropped it over her lap. The wool was thick, smelling strongly of horses and that faint, sharp clove scent. It was rough against her hands, but the heat it trapped was instantaneous. Briella pulled it up to her chest, her fingers clutching the edges. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the clatter of the iron-banded wheels. Nathaniel gave a curt nod, his gaze returning to the window. The carriage finally slowed, turning sharply off the wide, gas-lit avenue. The rhythmic sound of the hooves changed, transitioning from flat cobblestones to the hollow, echoing clack, clack, clack of a stone-paved courtyard. Briella opened her eyes. Through the rain-streaked glass, she saw towering walls of blackened Portland stone. Ashbourne House wasn't merely a townhouse, it was a fortress occupying an entire city block. It had no delicate ironwork fences or inviting porticos. It was sheer, imposing wealth, designed to intimidate rather than welcome. The carriage rolled to a halt beneath a massive stone archway, sheltering them from the rain. Instantly, the heavy oak double doors of the main house swung open. Light spilled out onto the wet granite paving stones, harsh, bright gaslight that made Briella squint. Two footmen in dark grey livery descended the steps. One opened the carriage door, unfolding the steps with a sharp, synchronized snap. Nathaniel exited first. He didn't wait to hand her down. He walked straight up the stone steps, peeling off his soaking wet gloves. Briella scrambled out, clutching her valise, which the other footman had already retrieved from the boot. She refused to surrender it to him, her knuckles white around the stiff leather handle. She followed the Duke, her ruined boots leaving a trail of watery mud on the pristine white marble of the entrance hall. The hall was cavernous. A sweeping double staircase of dark mahogany dominated the center of the space, rising to a gallery above. The air here didn't smell of lemon oil and anxiety like Aidan's home. It smelled of beeswax, wood smoke, and age. The silence was absolute, swallowed by the sheer scale of the architecture. A woman stood at the base of the stairs. She was tall, dressed in severe black bombazine, with a ring of heavy iron keys hanging at her waist. Her silver hair was pulled back so tightly it looked painful. She did not bow or curtsy. She simply waited. "Mrs. Gable," Nathaniel said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. He shrugged off his heavy overcoat, handing it to a waiting footman without looking. "This is Miss Anderson. She is the new archivist." Mrs. Gable's eyes, a pale, watery blue, flicked to Briella. They catalogued the ruined hat, the mud-stained skirt, the cheap canvas valise, and the fact that she was entirely unchaperoned. The housekeeper's face remained a mask of professional granite. "Very good, Your Grace. Shall I place her in the servants' quarters on the 4th floor?" "No," Nathaniel said flatly. "The east wing, the blue suite." For a fraction of a second, the granite cracked. Mrs. Gable's jaw tightened. "The blue suite, Your Grace. Those are guest chambers. They have not been prepared for a staff member." "They are prepared now," Nathaniel countered, his tone dropping into a dangerous, silken register. "Miss Anderson requires a fire, a hot bath, and whatever she requests for dinner. She is not a scullery maid. She is here to fix the disaster my grandfather made of the library. Treat her accordingly." "Yes, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable said stiffly. Nathaniel turned back to Briella. He looked at her, standing in the center of his marble floor, dripping dirty water, clutching her battered bag like a shield. "The library is on the 1st floor, north corridor. I expect you to begin your assessment tomorrow at 9. Rest until then." He didn't wait for her to agree. He simply turned and strode down a long, dimly lit hallway, his heavy boots echoing on the marble until he disappeared behind a pair of heavy, leather-bound doors. Briella was left standing with the housekeeper. "If you will follow me, Miss Anderson," Mrs. Gable said. Her tone was not actively hostile, but it was entirely devoid of warmth. It was the tone of a woman executing an absurd order under duress. Briella followed her up the sweeping staircase. Her damp skirts felt like lead weights. They walked down a long, wide corridor, lined with dark, imposing portraits of severe men who looked remarkably like Nathaniel. Mrs. Gable stopped before a white-panelled door and pushed it open. Briella stepped inside and stopped dead. The room was larger than the entire ground floor of her aunt's house. The walls were covered in pale blue silk damask. A massive 4-poster bed, draped in heavy velvet, dominated the center of the room. A fire was already snapping aggressively in a white marble fireplace, casting a warm, dancing light across a Persian rug that was thick enough to sink into. It was luxurious. It was silent. It was entirely alien. "A maid will be up shortly with hot water," Mrs. Gable said from the doorway. "Dinner is served in the staff dining hall at 7, but His Grace instructed you may take a tray in your room tonight, given your condition." "A tray would be preferable." "Thank you," Briella managed to say, her voice sounding thin and hollow in the vast room. Mrs. Gable gave a stiff nod and closed the door. The latch clicked shut, echoing in the quiet. Briella stood entirely alone in the center of the blue silk room. She dropped her canvas valise, It hit the floor with a dull thud, looking aggressively out of place against the expensive rug. She walked slowly toward the fireplace. The heat radiating from the grate hit her damp clothes, sending a violent shiver down her spine. She reached out, her fingers trembling violently, and gripped the edge of the cold marble mantelpiece. She stared into the flames. The smell of the burning birchwood was sharp and clean. Aidan's face, pale and anxious behind his desk, felt like a memory from a decade ago. Not 3 hours. The cramped, cabbage-scented hallway of Rookery Lane was gone. She was standing in the guest suite of the Duke of Ashbourne, a ruined woman with £14 to her name, hired to organise a library she had never seen. Her legs finally gave out. She sank to the floor right there on the rug, her wet skirts pooling around her. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapped her arms around them, and squeezed her eyes shut. She didn't cry. The exhaustion was too absolute for tears. She simply sat there, listening to the crackle of the fire, the sheer, impossible absurdity of the day finally crushing the breath out of her. The mattress was a trap of goose down. Brielle woke with a sharp gasp, her body instantly rejecting the unfamiliar, suffocating softness. She lay rigid, staring at the canopy of blue silk above her. Her limbs ached with a deep, bruised throb, a physical echo of yesterday's humiliation. The brass clock on the mantelpiece read 8 o'clock. The fire had burned down to a pile of grey, smoking ash. She threw back the heavy velvet quilt. The air in the room was biting, lacking the residual warmth of the small hearth in Rookery Lane. A silver tray sat on a side table near the door, a pot of tea, cold now, and a single, perfectly glazed pastry. The household staff had come and gone without making a sound. Brielle ignored the pastry. She poured the tepid tea into the delicate china cup and drank it in 3 long, desperate swallows. It tasted of expensive bergamot and isolation. She moved to the washstand. Beside the porcelain basin sat an array of crystal bottles filled with amber and rose-coloured oils. She pushed them aside. Reaching into her canvas valise, she retrieved her cake of yellow lye soap. She cracked the thin layer of ice that had formed over the pitcher's water, poured it into the basin, and scrubbed her face and neck until the skin burned red. The harsh, medicinal smell of the lye anchored her. She was not a guest. She was an employee. She dressed in the stiff grey skirt and the brown merino wool bodice. The fabric was heavy, unyielding, and smelled faintly of the damp canvas bag. It was armour. She pulled her dark hair back, twisting it into a severe, immovable knot at the nape of her neck, securing it with the bone-handled brush and pins. The north corridor was colder than the rest of the house, the air carrying a distinct, dry odour of crumbling leather and stagnant time. She found the double doors of the library easily. They were massive, carved oak and slightly ajar. Brielle pushed them open. The room was a cavern of neglect. It spanned the entire length of the wing, ringed by 2 tiers of iron-railed galleries. But the shelves were not the problem. The floor was the problem. Great, uneven mountains of paper, vellum, ledgers, and loose correspondence covered the Persian carpets like snowdrifts. Desks were buried under collapsed stacks of deteriorating folios. The air was thick with suspended dust, swirling sluggishly in the weak morning light, filtering through the tall, unwashed windows. It smelled of binding glue, dry rot, and dead moths. Standing in the centre of the chaos was Nathaniel. He wore no coat, only a stark white linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up past his elbows, and dark trousers. His forearms were corded with muscle and lightly dusted with dark hair. He held a crumbling, yellowed map in one hand, staring at it with an expression of profound irritation. He didn't look up as she entered. My grandfather believed filing was a conspiracy to hide the truth. My father believed the library was a suitable place to store hunting dogs during thunderstorms. He dropped the map onto a nearby pile. It slid off, scattering half a dozen loose letters across the floor. "You are exactly on time," he observed, finally turning his grey eyes toward her. They dragged over her severe grey skirt, the tightly pinned hair, the lack of any decorative ribbon or lace. "I expected you to run back to the cabbage water. I calculate my odds better than that, Your Grace," Briella said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the previous day's panic. She stepped fully into the room, her boots crunching audibly on a scattered pile of wax seals. "It is a disaster," Nathaniel said, gesturing broadly. "Estate records spanning 4 centuries, mixed with laundry bills, architectural plans, and letters of blackmail. Mrs. Gable refuses to let the maids in because a stack collapsed and broke a girl's collarbone 3 years ago." Briella looked at the sheer volume of ruin. A normal woman would weep. A normal woman would feel overwhelmed. Briella felt a slow, steady thrum of adrenaline begin to pulse behind her ribs. This was a catastrophe she could actually touch. A mess that required arithmetic, not emotion. "Where are the current ledgers?" she asked. Nathaniel raised a brow. He walked over to a massive mahogany desk near the fireplace, swiping a forearm across the surface to clear a layer of dust. He hauled 3 heavy, black-bound books from the floor and dropped them onto the wood with a heavy thud. "Here," he said. "The last 5 years. They balance, but the margins are erratic. The agent in Yorkshire is either a thief or an idiot. I need to know which before I ride north and break his jaw." Briella walked to the desk. She didn't ask for a chair. She simply stood, opened the top ledger, and ran her finger down the first column of figures. The ink was faded, the handwriting a cramped, defensive scrawl. "I require a separate table," Briella said, her eyes never leaving the page. 3 wire baskets, a fresh bottle of iron gall ink, a box of steel nibs, and a ledger of blank, ruled paper. "I also require the fire to be lit. The damp will destroy the vellum before I can catalogue it." The silence stretched. Briella finally looked up. Nathaniel was staring at her. The harsh predator's edge that had defined him yesterday was gone, replaced by a sharp, piercing intensity. He looked at her not as a discarded woman, but as a mechanism he had just wound up, watching the gears engage. "Mrs. Gable will bring the supplies," he said softly. "The fire is yours to manage. Wood is in the brass bin." He walked past her, his shoulder brushing heavily against hers. The scent of clove and clean linen briefly overpowered the smell of dry rot. "Do not drown in it, Briella," he said from the doorway. "I do not drown," she replied to the ledger. The heavy doors clicked shut. Briella stood alone in the freezing, ruined library. She took a deep breath of the dusty air, turned to the brass bin, and began to build a fire. 3 weeks passed. The library did not magically transform into a pristine archive, but a brutal, logical geography began to emerge from the chaos. Briella lived in ink. Her fingernails were permanently stained a bruised, greyish black. The skin of her hands grew rough from handling dry, crumbling paper and hauling heavy leather spines. She ate her meals at the desk, dropping crumbs onto century-old treaties, ignoring the scandalized looks of the footmen who brought her trays. She did not see Aidan. She did not hear from Matilda. The bleeding wound of her past had cauterized, replaced by the relentless rhythmic demands of Ashbourne's neglected history. It was near midnight on a Tuesday. A vicious storm battered the tall windows, rain lashing against the glass like thrown gravel. The library was illuminated by a single green glass oil lamp on her desk, casting a tight circle of yellow light against the pressing darkness. Briella was staring at a discrepancy in the 1822 grain yields from the Western estate. The numbers were entirely fictitious, a phantom crop sold to phantom buyers, the profits siphoned into a void. It was a beautiful, arrogant piece of embezzlement. The heavy doors groaned. Briella didn't jump. She merely lifted her head as Nathaniel walked into the pool of light. He was dressed in a dark, smoking jacket, his cravat untied, hanging loose around his throat. He looked exhausted. The shadows beneath his eyes were the colour of bruised plums. He carried a crystal decanter and 2 glasses. He didn't ask permission. He pulled a heavy leather wingback chair close to the desk, sat down, and poured the amber liquid. He pushed 1 glass across the polished wood toward her. "Yorkshire?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp in the quiet room. "Gloucestershire," Briella replied, leaning back in her chair. Her spine popped. "Your great-uncle's steward. He invented 300 acres of barley and pocketed the difference for nearly a decade. The math is incredibly sloppy, but your father never checked the physical boundary stones." Nathaniel let out a short, harsh breath that might have been a laugh. He took a drink of his brandy. Of course he didn't. He was too busy buying horses. He looked at her, really looked at her. Her hair was coming undone, stray dark strands falling across her face. A smudge of ink marked her left cheekbone. She looked entirely worn down, stripped of any pretense of polite society. "You work like a machine," Nathaniel said. It wasn't a compliment, it was an accusation. "You haven't left this room in 3 days except to sleep. Mrs. Gable says you barely eat." "I eat what is required." Briella didn't touch the glass he offered. She rested her ink-stained hands on the open ledger. "The work is required. The work is an excuse," Nathaniel countered. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, invading her space. The smell of clove and rain mixed with the sharp fumes of the lamp oil. "It is a wall you are building out of paper, so you don't have to think about the fact that your life was completely detonated." Briella's jaw tightened. A sudden hot flash of anger pierced her exhaustion. "My life was an illusion. I am entirely aware of that, Your Grace. I do not need you to psychoanalyze my filing methods." "Nathaniel," he said sharply. She blinked. "What? Stop calling me Your Grace when there is no one else in the room. It sounds like a defense mechanism." His grey eyes locked onto hers, stripping away the dark of the room. "Why did you not fight him, Briella? In that office? Why did you just take the ring off and walk away?" The question hit her like a physical blow. No one had asked her that. Matilda had screamed about the loss of money. Nathaniel had mocked Aidan's cowardice. But no one had asked why she surrendered so quietly. She stared at the flickering flame of the oil lamp. The silence stretched until the sound of the rain against the glass became deafening. "Because fighting requires hope," Briella whispered. The truth tasted like ash in her mouth. "If I fought, it would mean I believed he still wanted me. It would mean I believed I was worth keeping." The math was already done, Nathaniel. The ledger was closed. Lady Caroline brought salvation. I brought a cheap canvas bag and a spinster aunt. You cannot argue with mathematics. I walked away because watching a man force himself to pretend he was sorry is far worse than simply being abandoned. Nathaniel didn't move. He didn't offer a platitude. He just watched her face, reading the raw, ugly truth etched into the lines around her mouth. Slowly, he reached across the desk. His large, warm hand covered her ink-stained fingers, resting on the open ledger. He didn't grasp her hand tightly. He just anchored it. "He was an idiot," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping into a low, fierce register. "Not because he was broke, but because he had an iron spine sitting in his parlour for 3 years, and he traded it for a porcelain doll." Briella looked down at his hand, covering hers. The contrast was stark. His skin calloused from rains and weather, hers stained with ink and dust. Yet the weight of his touch was the most solid thing she had felt since the day her engagement broke. "I am not a victim, Nathaniel," she said, her voice steadying. "Do not pity me." "Pity?" The corner of his mouth curved into a dark, genuine smile. "Briella, you terrify my housekeeper. You have dismantled a century of my family's financial lies in 3 weeks. And you look at me as though I am merely an obstacle to your next inkwell. I do not pity you." He slowly withdrew his hand, picking up his glass of brandy. He raised it in a silent toast. "I recognized you," he said simply. "That is why I stopped the carriage." Briella finally picked up her own glass. The crystal was heavy and cold, but the liquid inside burned bright and warm. She looked around the cavernous, shadowy library, at the mountains of paper yet to be conquered, the cold stone, the isolated fortress she had been dragged into. It wasn't polite, it wasn't safe, but for the first time in 26 years, it felt entirely real. She met his grey eyes over the rim of the glass. "To the archives, then," she said. "To the archives," Nathaniel echoed. Conclusion. Thank you for watching the gripping conclusion of Briella's defiance. She walked away from a broken promise, only to find power in the shadows of a duke's ruined library. Their pragmatic, unyielding bond proves that sometimes salvation doesn't look like a rescue. It looks like a brutal, honest beginning. If you loved the tension and the triumph of this grounded romance, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment of Briella taking control?